The diner went dead silent the moment 6-year-old Daisy rolled up her sleeve. She wasn't showing her fresh bruises to a doctor or a cop. She was showing them to Sledge, a feared Hell's Angel everyone was terrified of. The room waited for him to snap. But what the biker did next didn't just silence the room. It brought an entire corrupt city to its knees. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe to help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Daisy sat by the window watching the relentless Pennsylvania rain wash away the grime of a dying steel town. Oak Creek was a place where dreams went to rust, and hope was a currency nobody had seen in decades. At 6 years old, she was already a ghost in her own life, haunting the corners of rooms and making herself smaller than a breath of air. Her large eyes held a terrifying depth of sorrow that no child should ever possess. The silence that surrounded her was not peaceful, but heavy, like a woolen blanket soaked in freezing water. Before we dive deeper into the heartbreaking reality of this little girl, I want to connect with you directly. I want to know where you are watching this story from right now. Please drop your city and country in the comments below so we can see how far this message travels. She had not spoken a single word in exactly 6 months, which was the exact amount of time since her mother married the new mayor. The doctors called it selective mutism, but Daisy knew it was simply survival. Words were dangerous things that could be twisted and used against you, so she swallowed them all until her throat ached. She learned that being invisible was the only shield she had against a predator who wore expensive suits and smiled for the cameras. The town saw a benevolent leader, but she saw the monster who lived behind closed doors. It is a tragedy when a child learns that their voice is a weapon that will backfire. You might think you would scream for help, but fear has a way of stealing the sound right out of your lungs before you can even open your mouth. Her only companion was a ragged stuffed rabbit with one button eye and an ear that had been sewn back on with clumsy stitches. She clutched it to her chest, as if it were the only anchor keeping her from drifting away into total nothingness. On the table in front of her lay a battered notebook filled with drawings that would make a grown man weep. She did not draw suns or flowers or happy families holding hands. She sketched jagged monsters with sharp teeth looming over a tiny stick figure girl who had no mouth. These were not just doodles. They were screams for help captured in graphite and paper because her vocal cords had forgotten how to work. It breaks your heart to see such darkness flowing from such small hands, but art is often the only language left for the broken. Despite the living nightmare of her daily existence, Daisy possessed a kindness that was almost painful to witness. She was the type of child who would apologize to a table if she bumped into it. If a waitress dropped a spoon, Daisy would be the first to slide off her chair to pick it up. Her spirit was fractured, but it was not corrupted. She absorbed the anger and the violence of her household like a sponge so that nobody else would have to feel it. It is a profound injustice that the people who deserve the most love are often the ones who receive the least of it. She carried the weight of adult sins on shoulders that were far too narrow. You have to wonder how much a soul can endure before it shatters completely into irreparable dust. Her mother was present in body, but her spirit had long since retreated behind a haze of prescription pills and paralyzing terror. Daisy did not blame her mother because she understood fear better than most adults ever will. Instead of seeking comfort, Daisy became the caretaker who would cover her mother with a blanket. When she passed out on the sofa, she would check the locks on the doors 3 times just to be sure they were safe for the night. It is a twisted reversal of nature when the child becomes the guardian of the parent. Daisy watched the world with the vigilance of a soldier in enemy territory, waiting for the next explosion. She was alone in a house full of people, and that is the loneliest feeling in the entire world. The setting for our story today is Patty's Diner, which smells of burnt coffee and stale cigarette smoke that lingers in the vinyl booths. It was a sanctuary of sorts where the locals came to stare into their mugs and forget their troubles for an hour or two. The fluorescent lights buzzed with a low hum that sounded like a headache waiting to happen. Daisy sat in the back booth where the shadows were deepest, trying to merge with the upholstery. Outside, the gray sky wept over the rusted skeletons of the factories that used to keep this town alive. The atmosphere was thick with resignation and the damp cold that seeps into your bones. This was a place where secrets were kept, not because they were hidden, but because people were simply too tired to look for them. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being constantly afraid. You could see it in the dark circles under her eyes which stood out starkly against her pale skin. Daisy was a porcelain doll walking through a minefield waiting for the click that would signal the end. She had no reason to believe that today would be any different from the hell of yesterday. She had no reason to believe that heroes existed outside of the comic books she was not allowed to read. But destiny has a funny way of intervening when the night is at its darkest. She sat there clutching her rabbit and staring at the door, unaware that the universe was about to shift on its axis. Sometimes help does not look like an angel. Sometimes it looks like a storm coming to wash everything everything clean. The bell above the diner door did not just chime, it announced an invasion. As the heavy wooden frame swung open, a blast of freezing wind and rain swept through the room, instantly chilling everyone to the bone. Framed in the doorway stood a mountain of a man who seemed to block out the gray light of the afternoon. He was a giant clad in black leather that was soaked through and dripping onto the linoleum floor like oil. His face was a roadmap of scars and hard miles hidden behind a thick beard that looked like tangled steel wire. The chatter in the diner died instantly, replaced by a silence so thick you could cut it with a knife. This was a man who carried violence like a second skin, and everyone knew it. He moved with a heavy limp that suggested a war wound or a motorcycle crash that should have killed him. Every step was a labor, as his heavy boots thudded against the floorboard, shaking the coffee in the cups nearby. He collapsed onto a stool at the counter, and the vinyl groaned in protest under his immense weight. The locals averted their eyes, pretending to read menus they had memorized 20 years ago. They saw a thug and a criminal, and a threat to their quiet little desperate lives. They did not see the exhaustion etched into his features, or the way his hand trembled as he reached for a napkin. It is easy to judge a book by its cover when you are too afraid to open it. From her dark corner in the back booth, Daisy watched the giant with wide, unblinking eyes. While the adult saw a predator, she saw something entirely different and far more profound. She saw the slump of his shoulders, which mirrored the way she felt every single day. She recognized the look of someone who was hurting and who had no one to tell about the pain. In her innocent logic, monsters were men in expensive suits who smiled while they hurt you. This man looked like a monster, but his eyes held a quiet sadness that called out to her own broken heart. Empathy is a dangerous gift for a child who has been taught to be invisible, but she could not turn it off. The air in the diner was static with tension, but Daisy made a choice that defied all her survival instincts. She slid off the cracked vinyl seat of her booth, and her feet barely made a sound on the floor. She clutched her one-eyed rabbit so tightly that her knuckles turned white against the worn fabric. The diner owner froze behind the counter, his eyes widening as he watched the little girl approach the biker. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the giant to snap or for someone to stop her. But nobody moved a muscle, because fear is a paralytic that keeps good people from doing the right thing. She walked through the valley of judgment alone. She stopped just inches away from his massive leather boot, which was larger than her entire head. The smell of wet leather and gasoline and rain surrounded him like a storm cloud. Sledge sensed the presence beside him and turned his head slowly, expecting a waitress or a threat. He looked down and down and down until his gaze landed on the tiny figure standing there. He blinked in confusion, because he was used to people crossing the street to avoid his shadow. To have this fragile creature stand within striking distance was something his combat-hardened brain could not immediately process. It was a meeting of two different worlds that had no business colliding in a place like this. Without a single word, Daisy lifted her arms and offered him her most prized possession. She held out the battered rabbit with the missing eye and the re-stitched ear toward his massive, trembling hand. It was a gesture of absolute purity that cut through the cynicism of the room like a laser. In her mind, she was giving him the only thing that had ever made her feel safe when the night was scary. She was offering him her protector because she thought he needed it more than she did right now. It is a rare and humbling thing to be on the receiving end of a child's unselfish love. Sledge stared at the toy as if it were a live grenade. The giant hesitated for a long moment, and his eyes shifted from the toy to the girl's serious face. Slowly, he reached out a hand that was tattooed and scarred, and thick with calluses. He took the rabbit with a delicacy that belied his brutal appearance, treating it like spun glass. The contrast was jarring as his massive fingers engulfed the small, plush toy almost completely. For the first time in years, the hard lines of his face softened just a fraction. He looked at the rabbit, and then back at Daisy, and he did not know what to say. He had been prepared for a fight or an insult, but he was completely unarmed by kindness. The exchange was almost complete when the incident happened that would change the course of history in Oak Creek. As Daisy stretched her arm fully to ensure he had a good grip on the rabbit, her sleeve slid up. It was a simple movement of fabric, but it revealed a secret that had been hidden in the dark. The oversized coat pulled back just enough to expose the pale skin of her forearm to the harsh diner lights. There was no sound, but the moment felt as loud as a gunshot to anyone who was paying attention. Sledge was paying attention, and what he saw made his blood turn into absolute ice in his veins. Etched into her skin was a bruise that was unmistakably the shape of a large hand. The marks of 4 fingers and a thumb were painted in angry shades of purple and yellow and black. It was a fresh injury that spoke of a grip tight enough to crush the bone beneath the flesh. It was not a playground scrape or a clumsy fall from a bicycle. It was the signature of violence left by someone who enjoyed inflicting pain on something smaller than themselves. The sight of it on such a small limb was a violation of every natural law. Sledge felt a roar building in his chest that started low and deep. The exhaustion vanished from Sledge's body, instantly replaced by a lethal and focused adrenaline. His eyes, which had been weary a moment ago, snapped into a predator's. Focus. He did not yell, and he did not throw the table across the room, though he wanted to. Instead, he went deadly still, which is always more terrifying than noise when it comes to dangerous men. He looked from the bruise up to Daisy's eyes and saw the resignation there. She did not pull away in shame, but stood there bearing witness to her own suffering. He recognized that look because he had seen it in the eyes of soldiers who had given up on rescue. He leaned forward slightly, and his voice was a low rumble that only she could hear. He asked her with his eyes who had done this to her, and she understood him perfectly. There was no need for words between two people who knew the language of pain so intimately. Daisy did not flinch away from his intensity because she saw the protection in it. She slowly pulled her sleeve back down, covering the mark, but the truth was already out in the open. She had shown him her darkness, and instead of running away, he had leaned into it. For the first time in her life, she felt seen. Daisy turned her head slowly toward the rain-streaked window at the front of the diner. She raised a small, trembling finger and pointed through the glass at the street outside. Sledge followed her gaze and saw a sleek black luxury sedan pulling into a parking space. It was a car that screamed power and money and arrogance in a town that had neither. The wipers slapped against the windshield like a metronome, counting down the seconds until disaster struck. Daisy looked back at Sledge, and the fear in her eyes was absolute and paralyzing. She was telling him without speaking that the monster was here, and he was coming for her. The engine of the luxury car died, and the heavy door opened to reveal a man in a suit. Sledge looked at the car and then back at the terrified little girl standing by his knee. He tightened his grip on the stuffed rabbit until the seams threatened to burst. In that split second, a covenant was formed that was stronger than steel and more binding than any law. He did not know who the man in the car was, but he knew that he was going to destroy him. The bell above the door jingled again, but this time it sounded like a funeral toll. The war had officially arrived at Patty's Diner. The atmosphere in the diner shifted from tense to suffocating as Marcus Miller swept into the room like a king reclaiming his wayward property. He was handsome in a plastic and manufactured way, with a jawline bought by old money and a smile that never reached his cold, shark-like eyes. He spotted Daisy standing next to the biker, and his face twisted into a mask of disgust that he quickly covered with fake paternal concern. He marched over and grabbed Daisy by the very same arm that Sledge had just inspected. His manicured fingers dug into the fresh bruise with precise cruelty, causing the girl to let out a silent gasp of agony that tore through the room. It was a calculated power move designed to show everyone present exactly who held the leash in this town. Sledge rose from his stool, and his massive frame seemed to expand until he blocked out the overhead lights. The sound of his leather jacket stretching was like the warning growl of a large predator about to strike. He locked eyes with the mayor, and for a second violence hung in the air like the smell of ozone before a lightning strike. Marcus did not back down, but instead sneered with the confidence of a man who has never lost a fight because he pays others to fight for him. He looked at the biker with pure classist disdain and laughed dryly. He apologized sarcastically for his daughter bothering the trash of the city and tightened his grip on her arm until her knees buckled. Before Sledge could deliver the punch that would have rearranged the mayor's perfect dental work, the local sheriff stood up from his half-eaten cherry pie. The lawman placed a heavy hand on his holster and stepped between the two men, acting as a human shield for the abuser. He warned Sledge to sit down and stop causing trouble for the good people of Oak Creek. The betrayal was absolute and transparent, as the badge that was supposed to protect the innocent was used to defend the monster. The sheriff knew exactly what was happening in that house, but his pension was tied to the mayor's goodwill. Justice in this town was not blind. It was bought and paid for by the highest bidder. Sledge looked around the room and saw the heads of the other patrons bowing in shame and submission. He realized that he was standing alone on an island of morality in a sea of cowardice. He was outnumbered and outgunned, and if he fought now, he would end up in a cell while Daisy went home to hell. He made the tactical decision to stand down, which is often the bravest thing a warrior can do. He memorized the license plate of the black sedan and the terrified look in Daisy's eyes as she was dragged toward the door. He sat back down on the stool and the vinyl groaned under the weight of his suppressed rage. You might be asking yourself why he didn't just call the state police or the FBI right then and there. The tragic reality is that the system is designed like a labyrinth where the Minotaur owns the map. In towns like Oak Creek, the institutions of protection are often the very tools of oppression used against the vulnerable. If Sledge had made that call, the report would have landed on the desk of the man who just threatened him. Daisy would have been labeled a liar or mentally unstable and returned to the custody of her tormentor within the hour. The failure here was not a mistake. It was a feature of a corrupt machine working exactly as intended. The school system had failed Daisy months ago when her first grade teacher noticed the dark circles and the silence. Mrs. Higgins had tried to file a report, but the principal called her into his office for a friendly chat about her contract renewal. He reminded her that Mayor Miller had personally funded the new gymnasium, and that accusations were a dangerous game to play without hard proof. The teacher was a good woman, but she needed her health insurance, so she swallowed her suspicions and looked the other way. The school became just another place where Daisy learned that adults would always choose their own comfort over her safety. The Child Protective Services Agency had also failed her during a scheduled visit that was nothing more than a theatrical performance. The caseworker was overworked and underpaid, and she was easily charmed by the mayor's expensive coffee and polished manners. When she asked about the bruises, Marcus explained that Daisy was a clumsy child who was prone to falling down the stairs. Daisy sat there with her mouth shut tight, knowing that speaking up would only result in a worse beating later that night. The file was marked as unfounded and closed with a rubber stamp that sounded like a coffin lid slamming shut. Even the local medical establishment was complicit in the conspiracy of silence surrounding the Miller household. When Daisy was brought to the emergency room with a fractured wrist, the doctor didn't ask difficult questions. He accepted the story about a fall from a swing set because the new pediatric wing was named after the mayor's grandfather. The Hippocratic Oath was quietly suspended in exchange for political favor and hospital funding. The medical records were sanitized, and the x-rays were filed away in a dark drawer where the truth went to die. Every safeguard that civilization had built to protect a child had been dismantled brick by brick. The deepest betrayal of all came from the one person who should have been a lioness protecting her cub. Daisy's mother sat in the passenger seat of the black sedan, popping another anxiety pill to drown out the reality. She saw the fear in her daughter's eyes, but she was too terrified of losing her lifestyle to intervene. She had traded her maternal instinct for security, and in doing so she had become an accomplice to the abuse. Silence in the face of evil is not neutrality, it is an endorsement of the crime. Daisy looked at her mother and saw only a hollow shell where a parent used to be. That night, the situation inside the Miller mansion escalated from chronic neglect to an acute emergency. Marcus was furious about the public embarrassment at the diner, and his rage filled the house like poisonous gas. He dragged Daisy into the hallway and threw her favorite notebook into the fireplace, watching the monster she drew turn into ash. He screamed that she was broken and ungrateful, and that he was finally going to fix the problem for good. The violence was not just physical anymore, it was a systematic erasure of her identity. He was stripping away every last thing she loved to leave her completely empty. The ultimate threat was delivered with a cold and sadistic calmness that was more terrifying than his shouting. He informed Daisy that first thing in the morning, she would be sent to a special boarding school 3 states away. He told her it was a place for girls who refused to speak, and that she would never embarrass him again. It wasn't a school, it was a warehouse for unwanted children, where she would be medicated into oblivion. Daisy understood with crystal clarity that if she got in that car tomorrow, she would disappear from the world forever. This was the end of the line. Up in her room, Daisy packed her tiny backpack with the slow, deliberate movements of a prisoner walking to the gallows. She put in her one remaining pair of socks and looked for her rabbit, before remembering she had given it to the giant. For a moment, panic seized her chest, but then a strange calm settled over her. She had given her protector away so that he could be safe, and that was a good thing. She sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the moon, knowing that no knights were coming to save her. She accepted her fate with a maturity that was heartbreaking to witness. But while Daisy was accepting defeat, Sledge was busy declaring war in the pouring rain outside a dive bar. He had not left town, but had instead gone underground to tap into a network that the sheriff didn't know existed. He spoke with waitresses and janitors and old veterans who saw everything and said nothing to the police. He learned about the transfer, scheduled for the next morning during the Founders' Day parade. The intel confirmed his worst fears, that the mayor planned to dispose of the girl while the town was distracted by the celebration. The clock was ticking down and every second felt like a hammer blow. Sledge realized that the legal avenues were not just dead ends, they were traps laid by the enemy. If he tried to play by the rules, the girl would be gone before he could file the paperwork. The only way to save her was to operate completely outside the boundaries of the corrupt law. He had to become the monster that the town feared in order to defeat the monster the town worshipped. It was a paradox that only a man with nothing to lose could understand. He finished his cigarette and crushed it under his boot with a finality that signaled the end of diplomacy. He pulled a heavy encrypted radio from his saddlebag and keyed the mic with a thumb that no longer trembled. He did not call the police and he did not call the news stations. He dialed the direct line to the national president of his club, a man who commanded an army of outlaws. His voice was gravel and steel as he spoke, the words that would bring a hurricane to Oak Creek. "We have an angel in distress. Sector 4. Bring everyone. This is a code black." He released the button and looked at the mayor's house on the hill. The system had failed Daisy, but the Brotherhood was about to balance the scales. Founders' Day in Oak Creek was a spectacle of forced patriotism and hollow celebration, designed to make the decaying town look vibrant. Red, white, and blue bunting draped the rotting facades of the buildings, while a Amanuari de high school brass band played slightly out of tune. Mayor Marcus Miller stood at the podium basking in the adoration of a crowd that feared his influence more than they loved his policies. He looked like the picture of success in his tailored suit, holding the heavy ceremonial key to the city high above his head. Beside him stood Daisy, dressed in a stiff white dress that made her look like a porcelain doll ready for display. Her eyes were vacant holes staring at nothing, because she knew that as soon as the applause died down, she would be shipped away forever. The car was already idling behind the stage like a hearse waiting for a body. The first sign that the world was about to change was not a sound, but a vibration that traveled through the soles of everyone's shoes. It started as a subtle tremor that rippled through the coffee in the styrofoam cups held by the spectators in the front row. The pigeons that usually flocked around the bronze statue of the town founder suddenly took flight in a chaotic cloud of gray feathers. People looked at each other with confusion furrowing their brows, wondering if an earthquake was striking the stable ground of Pennsylvania. The air pressure dropped suddenly and heavily, causing ears to pop and the hair on the back of necks to stand up. It was the primal instinct of the herd, sensing a predator approaching from the distance, long before they could see it. Nature knew what was coming, before the humans realized their reality was about to shatter. Then came the sound, low and guttural, like the growl of a beast waking from a century of sleep deep beneath the earth. It was not the chaotic noise of highway traffic, but a synchronized thrumming that resonated in the chest cavity of every man, woman, and child. The glass windows of the storefronts began to rattle in their frames, singing a nervous song of anticipation against the brickwork. The mayor faltered in his speech, his voice wavering as the microphone picked up the encroaching frequency of the disruption. It grew louder and louder, rolling down the valley hills like an avalanche of pure sonic energy that could not be stopped. This was the sound of 800 V-twin engines screaming in unison, a mechanical war cry that demanded absolute attention. The ground itself seemed to be breathing in time with the rhythm of the approaching storm. Every head in the town square turned simultaneously toward the eastern horizon, where the main road crested the highest hill. At O.E. First, there was only the gray sky and the wet asphalt shining in the morning light. Then the sun broke through the clouds and glinted off a wall of chrome that appeared at the top of the rise. It was blinding and magnificent, a sudden flash of silver that stretched from one side of the road to the other. The silhouette of the lead rider emerged dark and ominous against the brightness, followed by another and another and another. They crested the hill, like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, multiplied by 200 riding hard. The visual impact was so intense that the crowd collectively gasped, sucking the oxygen out of the square in a single breath. They did not come as a trickle, they came as a sudden flood that poured down the street with unstoppable momentum. It was a river of steel and leather and righteous fury that filled every inch of the roadway from curb to curb. There were not just 10 or 20 bikes as the sheriff might have expected in his worst nightmares. There were hundreds upon hundreds of them, a dense formation that stretched back as far as the eye could see. The colors of the different chapters mixed together, forming a patchwork quilt of brotherhood that transcended state lines. They rode with a military precision, wheel to wheel and fender to fender, occupying the space with an arrogance that said they owned the pavement. It was an overwhelming display of force that made the police cruisers look like children's toys. The sensory overload was absolute. The procession entered the town square and surrounded the terrifying terrified gathering of locals. The roar of the engines was deafening, a physical force that battered the eardrums and vibrated the teeth in your skull. The smell of high-octane exhaust and hot oil replaced the scent of popcorn and cotton candy, choking the air with the perfume of rebellion. The ground trembled violently enough to knock over the folding chairs that had been set up for the elderly residents. Mayor Miller shouted into his microphone, but his voice was swallowed whole by the thunder of the machines. It was a sonic domination that rendered his political authority completely mute in the face of raw power. The city belonged to the engines now, and they were screaming for justice. The reaction of the villains was a study in pure, unadulterated terror, as their bubble of invincibility burst instantly. Marcus Miller went pale, his tan fading instantly as he gripped the podium to keep from collapsing in front of his voters. The arrogance drained out of his face, leaving behind the pathetic fear of a bully who has finally met someone bigger. The sheriff, who had been so brave in the diner, looked at the army of outlaws and took a subconscious step backward. He realized with a sinking heart that his badge and his gun were useless against a force of this magnitude. The corrupt city council members huddled together like frightened sheep, realizing that their money could not buy their way out of this retribution. They were small men facing giants, and they knew they had lost. The bikers did not attack the crowd, nor did they drive through the barricades in a chaotic rampage of destruction. Instead, they executed a perfect encirclement maneuver that cut off every possible exit from the town square. They parked their heavy machines in a tight ring facing inward, creating a wall of metal and flesh that was impenetrable. It was a siege line established in seconds, turning the open plaza into a courtroom where there would be no appeal. The riders sat on their idling bikes, staring silently behind dark sunglasses, their faces masks of stone. They were not there to riot. They were there to witness and to judge the sins of the powerful. The precision of their movement was more terrifying than any act of random violence could ever be. Then, as if controlled by a single mind, 800 engines were cut at the exact same second. The sudden silence that crashed down on the square was heavier and more oppressive than the noise had been. The ringing in everyone's ears was the only sound for a long heartbeat until a baby started crying in the distance. The stillness was thick with threat and anticipation, hanging over the crowd like a guillotine blade waiting to drop. Nobody moved and nobody spoke as the bikers kicked down their kickstands with a synchronized clank that sounded like a prison door locking. They dismounted slowly, their boots hitting the pavement with a heavy rhythmic thud. 800 pairs of arms crossed over 800 leather-clad chests. The jury had taken their seats. From the center of the formation, the crowd parted like the Red Sea to allow a single figure to pass through. Sledge walked toward the stage, his limp pronounced, but his stride purposeful and unstoppable. He carried his helmet in one hand and the battered stuffed rabbit in the other, holding it like a sacred relic. He did not look at the police officers who instinctively moved their hands to their holsters before thinking better of it. He walked up the wooden stairs of the gazebo, the boards creaking under his massive weight. The sheriff stepped forward to block him, but Sledge simply looked at him and the lawman froze in his tracks. There are some men you do not stop, and Sledge was all of them combined. Sledge ignored the mayor, completely treating him as if he were nothing more than a stain on the floorboards. He walked straight to Daisy, who was trembling so violently that her white dress looked like it was vibrating. He stopped in front of her, and for the second time he lowered his massive frame to the ground. He knelt on one knee, bringing his scarred face level with hers, shrinking himself to be less frightening. The contrast between the giant biker and the tiny girl was a heartbreaking image of disparity. He held out the rabbit to her and she took it, clutching it to her chest as her lifeline. He whispered to her that she didn't have to be afraid anymore because her family had arrived. This is the moment where everything changes, the moment where the scales finally tip back toward righteousness. Seeing this giant of a man kneel before a powerless child is the definition of true strength in a world gone wrong. If you believe that power should be used to protect the innocent and not to shield the predators, smash that like button right now. Your engagement sends a signal to the algorithm that people still care more about justice than they do about politics. We need to show the world that there are still wolves who guard the sheep against the darkness. Let's get this video to 10,000 likes to honor every child who needs a hero today. Don't just watch, take a stand with us and prove that courage still exists. Sledge stayed on his knee and asked Daisy gently if she was brave enough to show the town the truth. He told her that she didn't have to say a word because her skin would speak for her. Daisy looked at the wall of bikers surrounding the square, and for the first time she saw a fortress instead of a threat. She looked at Marcus, who was sweating and shaking his head in a silent plea for her to keep her secret. But the spell of his terror was broken by the presence of the Brotherhood standing guard. Daisy nodded slowly and took a deep breath that filled her small lungs with the new air of freedom. She reached for the cuffs of her pristine white sleeves. The movement was small, but it was amplified by the massive jumbotron screen screen that had been set up for the mayor's speech. As Daisy rolled up her sleeves, the camera operator zoomed in, capturing the horrific landscape of her abuse in high definition. The image of the purple handprints and the yellowing bruises was projected 20 feet high for all to see. A collective gasp tore through the crowd, a sound of pure horror and realization that chilled the blood. The whispers started instantly spreading like wildfire through the stunned population who could no longer deny the truth. The proof was undeniable, and it was ugly, and it was staring them right in the face. The mask of the perfect family had been ripped away, leaving only the raw, rotting truth beneath. The atmosphere in the square shifted instantly from confusion to a righteous and burning anger directed at the stage. The townspeople who had ignored the signs and looked the other way could no longer deny what was in front of them. The admiration they held for the mayor curdled into disgust in the span of a single heartbeat. Neighbors looked at each other with guilt and realization, seeing their own complicity in the silence that had protected him. Marcus Miller stood alone on the stage, stripped of his power and his prestige by the revelation. He was no longer the mayor. He was a child abuser exposed in the harsh light of day. The illusion of his invulnerability shattered into a million pieces that could never be put back together. Sledge stood up and took the microphone from the podium, his hand engulfing the device completely. He did not shout and he did not scream because he didn't have to raise his voice to be heard. His voice boomed through the speakers, deep and calm and terrifyingly final, echoing off the buildings. "The law of this city has failed this child," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd and landing on the sheriff. "But our law does not fail. From this day forward, she is a daughter of the club, and she is under our protection." The declaration was absolute, a binding contract sealed in front of 1,000 witnesses. He was not asking for permission. He was informing them of a new reality that they had no choice but to accept. At his signal, the 800 bikers turned their backs to the crowd and faced the stage in unison. They formed a literal wall of leather and patches of human shield that separated Daisy from the rest of the world. It was a powerful visual metaphor of the protection she now enjoyed against those who would hurt her. No one could get to her without going through them first, and nobody was foolish enough to try. Daisy stood on the stage holding Sledge's hand and looked out at the sea of uncles who had ridden through the rain to save her. The nightmare was over, not because the sun came out, but because the monsters had been chased away by bigger, scarier monsters who were on her side. The humiliation of Marcus Miller was total and absolute, as the illusion of his power dissolved like sugar in hot water. Under the crushing weight of 800 stares, the sheriff finally remembered the oath he was supposed to uphold in this county. He approached the sputtering mayor not with a handshake, but with a pair of steel handcuffs that clicked shut with a satisfying finality. Marcus screamed about lawsuits and political connections, but his words were drowned out by the jeers of the very citizens who had cheered him minutes ago. It was a visceral reminder that authority without morality is nothing but a house of cards waiting for a breeze. Sledge watched the arrest with folded arms, his face impassive as the predator was dragged away kicking and screaming like a spoiled child. The monster who had thrived in the shadows was finally burning in the light. With the tyrant removed, the heavy blanket of fear that had suffocated Oak Creek began to lift instantly. The townspeople who had been too afraid to speak suddenly found their voices joining in a chorus of condemnation against the man they had once feared. The school principal and the corrupt social workers looked at their shoes, unable to meet the gaze of the little girl they had failed so miserably. It was a harsh lesson in complicity, proving that evil only triumphs when good people decide to do absolutely nothing. The bikers did not need to use violence because their presence alone was enough to shatter the corrupt status quo. They had held up a mirror to the community and forced everyone to look at the ugly reflection staring back at them. Justice had not just been served, it had been aggressively installed. Daisy's mother stood at the edge of the stage, looking like a sleepwalker who had finally been shaken awake by a thunderclap. Seeing an army of leather-clad strangers defending her daughter when she had failed to do so broke something inside her. The fog of medication and terror lifted enough for her to realize that she had a second chance to be a parent. She rushed to Daisy not to silence her, but to hold her, burying her face in the child's hair and sobbing apologies. Sledge stepped back to give them space, but kept his shadow over them, a silent promise that nobody would ever hurt them again. The cycle of abuse had been severed not by a therapist or a judge, but by a brotherhood that refused to tolerate cruelty. For the first time in years, the future looked like an open road instead of a dead end. But the ceremony was not over because the brotherhood does not leave without marking their own. Sledge walked back to his bike and retrieved a small object that had been crafted with immense care overnight. He returned to the stage and held up a tiny leather vest stitched with the same heavy thread as his own battle-worn cut. On the back, in stark white letters, It did not say prospect or hang around, but simply read, Little Sister, above the club logo. He knelt and placed the vest over Daisy's white dress, armoring her in the colors of the tribe that had adopted her. It was a baptism by leather, a formal declaration that she was now under the eternal protection of the pack. She ran her hands over the rough material, feeling the weight of 1,000 brothers resting on her small shoulders. The silence that followed was different from the silence of the past 6 months, because it was filled with anticipation rather than fear. Daisy looked up at Sledge, her eyes no longer vacant, but filled with a light that had been missing for too long. She reached out and touched his bearded face, her small fingers tracing the scar on his cheek with tender curiosity. Then, she did the impossible. She opened her mouth and the rusty hinges of her voice box finally gave way. "Thank you," she whispered, the sound small and raspy but clear enough to be heard by every heart in the square. It was 2 simple words, but they carried the weight of a mountain moving. Sledge nodded once, swallowing the lump in his throat because bikers don't cry even when their hearts are bursting. The departure was as majestic as the arrival, but with a completely different energy pulsing through the air. Sledge lifted Daisy onto the front of his massive bike, settling her securely between his arms like a precious jewel. Her mother climbed onto the back of another bike, surrounded by the protective flank of the officers. 800 engines roared to life simultaneously, a symphony of freedom that signaled the end of the occupation. They formed a diamond formation around the lead bike, creating a moving fortress of steel that no force on earth could penetrate. As they rolled out of the town square, the crowd did not hide in fear, but erupted into spontaneous applause. They were watching a rescue mission that looked like an invasion, witnessing the paradox of scary men doing a beautiful thing. They rode out of the valley and away from the gray skies of Oak Creek, heading toward a new beginning in a neighboring state. The club set Daisy and her mother up in a safe house far from the reach of political corruption and bad memories. The legal fees were paid anonymously, and the divorce papers were served to Marcus in his jail cell. Back in the town, the story became a legend that was whispered in diners and schoolyards for a generation. The diner owner framed the napkin Sledge had used and hung it on the wall as a reminder to never judge a book by its cover. The monsters in Daisy's notebook stopped chasing the little girl and started running away from the bikers. She learned that family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's just oil and loyalty. This story teaches us a fundamental truth about the nature of courage and the deceptive appearance of morality. We are taught to trust suits and badges while fearing tattoos and leather, but the world is rarely that simple. True honor is not found in the laws written by powerful men, but in the code of those who are willing to bleed for a stranger. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it is the refusal to let fear dictate your actions when an innocent person is suffering. Daisy found her voice not because she was saved, but because she was empowered by people who believed she was worth fighting for. We all have a little bit of that silence inside us, waiting for someone to come along and help us break it. As we close this chapter, I want you to take a moment and think about the people in your life who need a shield. Maybe you can be that shield for someone else even if you don't ride a motorcycle or wear a patch. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that heroes still walk among us, often in the most unlikely disguises. They don't always wear capes or fly through the sky to save the day. Sometimes they wear leather vests and ride thunder into the heart of the storm. If this story moved, you leave a comment below and tell me about your unsung hero. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your heart brave, because you never know when you might need to be an angel.